Now, homeless charity Novus will today warn government TDs about the staggering levels of self-harm and suicide attempts among women in their dedicated female services. And their communication and development coordinator, Dr. Una Burns, joins us now. Una, can you give us a sense of how difficult it is, I suppose, currently for women attending your service?
Yeah, morning, Ciara. It's extremely difficult for the women that access our services. International research last year indicated that women find it more difficult than men to access homeless services and are reluctant to engage in formal support services for longer periods of time because of the male-dominated environment of lots of shelter-style accommodation. So it's really important for us as providers to ensure that we have dedicated spaces for those women who find it hard to engage in services because of the men that are living there, particularly for women who may have experienced gender or sexual or domestic violence. The women that we work with have very complex needs relating to their mental health and addiction, and it sometimes can be very difficult for them to access supports around this. And because of this, we've seen a huge spike in the number of women who are experiencing suicidal ideation, self-harm and suicide attempts. And in just one of our services, in a 10-month period last year, our staff intervened on 26 occasions in very serious suicide attempts. So it's extraordinary, and we certainly considered it a crisis among the people we support, and not just in our women's services and all our services, but more acutely felt in our women's services.
And I'm sure that is awful for the women involved, but also awful for the staff trying to cope with it. What do you need, Una? What would help the current crisis? And I've no doubt that most people who attend your service do have things like dual diagnoses of addiction and mental health difficulties and all of that.
That's correct, Ciara, and that's a really key point, that the dual diagnosis of addiction and mental health is identified and treated, speedily, because we find that the women that we work with can often be, and all the clients that we work with in SGA accommodation can be bounced around from services to services with mental health citing an addiction problem and vice versa. And all the time, the addiction is becoming more entrenched, the mental health becomes more acute and enduring, and it's deeply traumatizing, that experience, for people who are marginalised even further then by their inability to access support. So we do need more rapid interventions around the support of dual diagnosis. We need a good standard of accommodation for people when they live in SGA accommodation. It's very difficult for people with complex needs, sometimes with challenging behaviour, to share with a stranger. It often deepens their suspicions and makes their behaviour more difficult, because, it's difficult for any adult who doesn't know somebody to be sharing a room with them, never mind when they might have, deeply difficult issues, personal traumatising issues that they have to deal with themselves. And we need sufficient pathways, exit pathways, for those women to access 1 and 2 bed units of accommodation in the community with the wraparound supports that they need.
The move on accommodation issue.
That's right, Ciara, because, it's well documented that single homeless people spend really, really long periods of time in temporary accommodation because of the lack, particularly of 1 and 2 bed units. About 50 or 60% of all our social housing waiting lists around the country are for smaller units of accommodation, and we are just not building them at the degree that we need them. And until those social housings come through, we need HAP payments then to reflect the really serious rising rents that we have. And, just in the piece the feature that you had just before this around the extraordinary levels of utility bills and other, basic household items like food and toiletries, that's so big for people, those increases, particularly for those who are living in the private rented market and are already paying extraordinary rents, that we're seeing more people that are going to be pushed into homelessness because of those increased costs as well.
Okay. And I suppose finally, are you looking for funding? Are you looking for specifically extra staff, or there must be, I suppose, a wish list of things that might improve things currently?
Yeah, I think the really key bit for the women that we're working with that are really entrenched in their addiction and mental health at the moment is the access to supports outside our services. So the access to mental health and addiction supports and the standard of accommodation that they receive while they're in temporary accommodation is really key for the immediate term. And then in the long term, of course, we need more options around housing and more housing first options that are dedicated to women and that understand course of behaviour, and that often is a reason that the women's long-term options fail and they end up back in it because they are subject to coercive control and gender-based violence when they move out. So long-term dedicated accommodation to women that's supported is really important.
Thank you very much for speaking to us this morning. This is Communication and Development Coordinator Dr. Una Burns from the Novus Homeless Service. And if you have been affected by the issues raised in this item, you can contact the Samaritans helpline on 116123.